Hello, my name is Laura Irvin, and today I'm going to talk to you about Dr. Thomas Brewer and the civil rights movement in Columbus, Georgia. So the South spent years denying political and legal freedoms to African Americans under Jim Crow laws. The laws stated that African Americans and whites must remain separate but equal. Black citizens were marginalized by these laws and were not allowed to vote, attend public schools, or work with white people. Their separate facilities often laid in disrepair and disarray, and were not equal to white facilities. Court cases, boycotts, and freedom marches are the cornerstone of the civil rights movement, which enacted change. Similarly, nonviolent direct action, the classic tactics of mass protest, was one tactic among many used by Black Georgians. Registering to vote, casting a ballot, lobbying, or making legal challenges, applying economic pressure, staying away from schools, and at times undertaking violent actions were other overt strategies that were employed. One man used those tactics to smash the evil and racist ways of segregationists. That man was Thomas H. Brewer. Dr. Thomas H. Brewer was a physician in Columbus, Georgia. He risked his life and worked to end white domination under Jim Crow laws. He worked to alleviate racial discrimination faced by him and other African Americans. In their heyday, systems of domination often appeared unshakable, but Brewer would fight and shake the Southern domination to the core. He fought for equality for Blacks oppressed by the racial discrimination by requesting improvements to the Black facilities and the abilities to access public goods like their white counterparts. A leader in the community, Brewer established the National Association for Advancement for Colored People in Columbus, Georgia, to encourage the advancement of African Americans and also to end desegregation in politics. Brewer was not deterred by threats of violence, and he continued his quest to end racial discrimination. Dr. Thomas Brewer advanced the civil rights movement in Columbus, Georgia through protesting and petitioning financial support from the Columbus City Council. He was proven successful in his advancement of the movement by eliminating the Democratic white primary, fighting segregation on the golf course, and advocating for equality in the recreational facilities and public health services. He was also a voice for African American police officers on the police force. Columbus had a history of not allowing African Americans on the police force, and when they were allowed on the police force, they were only allowed to arrest African Americans. And Dr. Brewer was instrumental in allowing them to get hired and then pushing for them to be able to do more than just arrest African Americans and patrol African American neighborhoods. Dr. Brewer's untimely death in his department store left many residents questioning if his tenacity and pushiness was part of the reason for his death, and they questioned the status quo of working to desegregate the South. They also thought that perhaps his work on desegregating the public schools might have led to his demise. Dr. Brewer achieved change in segregationist policies by going against the Democratic white primary. In 1946, the convention adopted a set of rules which would have barred African Americans from participating in the primary on the assumption that the legislation would pass a white primary bill. Prior to the convention, it was well understood by African Americans that they were not allowed to vote in the primary. The convention's purpose was to dissuade African Americans from pursuing legal actions. Brewer went against the white establishment by convincing Primus King to vote in the primary. Brewer was the driving force behind the subsequent court lawsuit and the campaign to finance it. His ability to convince King to vote in the Democratic primary was a step to ending disenfranchisement for the African Americans in Columbus, Georgia. It was about testing the Democratic primary for African Americans when Primus King went to vote. Primus King is quoted as saying, "Several talked about it, you see, Dr. Brewer and all the rest of the Hyatt men. They talked about it, but in other words, nobody would put a bell around the cat's neck. I told him, I said, I will. We went down, I say we. They carried me down to the courthouse and they stood on 10th Street and they run over to a one-way street. The men got out and I walked on down. I went in there and I voted. And when I went in, the detectives grabbed me up and asked, "What in the hell are you doing in here?" And I said, "I'm going to vote, sir." Detective said, "Ain't no African Americans voting in here today." Detectives grabbed me and they jumped in their car and flew and left me with the bag holding it. That happened on July 4th, 1944. King would go on to sue the Democratic primary. The case would be held in Macon County because it was too dangerous to be heard in Muscogee County. The case was heard and then ruled upon and moved to New Orleans. Brewer was instrumental in moving this case forward by pushing for funding. Brewer pushed for monetary support and other contributions to earn the ability to vote in the primary. Brewer noted in his letter to Dr. U.S. Johnson that African Americans have already started to enjoy the fruits of the Primus King case. The letter was to solicit funds to advance the case, and it noted that the NAACP, although erroneously stated, would not be involved in the lawsuit. He also kept a list of those who were contributing to the case and how much each person, each church, or organization gave to the case. Brewer demanded funds to help move this case forward and change the way the Democratic primary was viewed in Columbus. His pursuit and push for change against de facto segregation, though, resulted with the state's retaliation of their use of de jure segregation and trying to create laws that would prohibit African Americans their equal rights to voting and electing their representative. This follows the civil rights movement in the country as well. The long-range goal was equality, economic, political, social, and racial. Equality is the heart and essence of the democracy and freedom and justice. Without equality in the social relations and in all phases of human endeavor, the African American is certainly to be consigned to an inferior status. Brewer's advancement of civil rights followed a similar path as the national civil rights movement. During this time period, President Roosevelt would change the makeup of the Supreme Court by adding 4 new justices who clearly knew the importance of the African American vote to the Democratic Party and the necessity of maintaining a political alliance between African Americans and the party. The change in the court allowed the grievances of African Americans to be heard in court battles like Primus King and Dr. Brewer's to move through the circuit courts without immediately being ruled against. Brewer would petition the city of Columbus repeatedly to improve areas where the majority of the citizens were African American. Court cases like Plessy versus Ferguson stated that separate but equal conditions were fair under the law, and this did not violate the 14th Amendment, but Brewer used that terminology to petition the Columbus Council to change the living conditions of African Americans. His determination and persistence towards equality can be seen multiple times as he addressed the council on behalf of African American citizens. Dr. Brewer pushed for a change that would result in his untimely death. And his change, what his death would result in is Dr. Brewer would witness the death or the beating of a young African American man by 2 police officers in Columbus next to the department store that he owned and rented to a man named Lucio Flowers. And when Dr. Brewer witnessed this, and he knew that Lucio Flowers also witnessed this horrific beating of the man, he would explain that Lucio Flowers, a white man, would need to come forward. And so Dr. Brewer would try to attempt to engage Flowers in a conversation about police violence that he had previously witnessed, Flowers and Brewer. And Flowers claimed that he would be intimidated by Dr. Brewer in his request to come forward about the beating that he saw. Flowers would have 2 police officers, 2 detectives in his building when Dr. Brewer came to see him to address this. Flowers would shoot Brewer 7 times and kill him in a room once removed from where the officers were. Brewer's death created shockwaves in the African American community. His death would stunt the growth of change for African Americans. Unlike the death of Dr. King in 1968, when the ghettos boiled over, Columbus's black elite would leave the city with his death towards the African American community. But civil rights worked. Brewer worked relentlessly to change Columbus and force the elite and government officials to integrate and create areas of equality for African Americans. Although not all of his ambitions would be realized in his quest for civil rights in his hometown, His tireless devotion created change, and they allowed for future events to transpire. Many people thought that Brewer's tactics were too pushy, and that makes him slightly controversial because they believe he pushed too hard for things to get changed, like the schools, desegregating the schools in Columbus, and they think that's what led to his ultimate demise. Brewer was able to progress the movement. His ability to petition the courts allowed for the enfranchisement of black citizens, including black police officers and law enforcement, and petitioning for the city for equality in the schools and in public areas, which all coalesced and created a Columbus in which segregation was not persistent. While there were still some areas of weaknesses and violence that created turmoil and fear, black citizens were able to create new lives for themselves that did not require them to be looked at as second-class citizens. Eventually, Columbus would integrate its schools, parks, and golf course, but it did not happen immediately amidst racist attitudes of miscegenation and mixing of the races. Brewer played a key role in the civil rights in Columbus with the force of the federal government with the creation of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Change would be inevitable for Columbus and its African American citizenry. The civil rights movement, therefore, played a key role in the transforming of the American South and Columbus, Georgia, and Brewer was a key component to ensure that Columbus was transformed. Thank you.